Were you taught to swaddle your baby after giving birth in the hospital? As a result, did your baby sleep for hours on end and have trouble waking up to feed? Did your baby have a lot of weight loss? And were you worried about breastfeeding? Today I'm going to talk about swaddling and when it is appropriate and when it might not be appropriate for your baby and your family. So let's get into it. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic medical and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. Okay, so as always, this is a topic where there is no one right way. And if swaddling works for you and your family, and if it's a way for you to get some extra sleep and for you to be able to rest, especially in a day and age when we get so little support in taking care of our babies, then of course it can be a tool for you to use. However, here's what I notice about many newborn babies, and here's what the literature tells us as well, is that when we swaddle babies, they sleep for such long stretches that often they are not giving us the signals that they are hungry, and they do not feed as frequently as they need to in those early days and weeks, and their inborn feeding behaviors get tampered with, and the breastfeeding relationship gets interfered with because of swaddling. Swaddling has been in practice for hundreds, thousands of years. So if you look at the history of swaddling, I will link a few articles about swaddling, and all of which have links that you can go to yourself. But there is one in a Journal of Medical Humanities, and it goes through the history of swaddling. And we know that swaddling was done as early as 4000 BC in Central Asia. And then from there, it probably got spread through trade routes. And it has looked different across the centuries. So sometimes babies were swaddled by being connected to hard boards, or sometimes they were bound way more tightly than they are now. And they were swaddled for various reasons, like to keep evil spirits away from the communities, because some people groups believed that babies were born with evil spirits, and so the evil spirits needed to be kept away from the rest of the community. And that is definitely not why most of us swaddle our babies now. But what we do know about why babies are swaddled now is that babies are born with very active startle reflexes, and in order to reduce SIDS and other and baby suffocating on sleeping surfaces, we have babies in the Back to Sleep campaign. We have babies sleeping on their backs, and that means that babies startle way more frequently, because when babies slept on their stomachs, they did not startle themselves to sleep as frequent. They did not startle themselves to awake as often. And so when we wrap them up tightly, nice and cozy, then they don't startle awake. But that means that babies are also not signaling their hunger cues. So, when we look at baby hunger cues, there is a continuum of least hungry to most hungry. And when babies are swaddled, they cannot give us those earliest hunger signals because they are so cozy, so comfortable, and their limbs are wrapped up so tightly that some of those earliest hunger signals, like starting to wiggle around, starting to flutter their eyelids, moving their hands up to their mouth, they are not able to show us those signals. And so then they get to the crying and they finally wake up, and then they are so disorganized once they start crying that it is much harder for them to latch, and then breastfeeding becomes much more difficult by the time they get to the actual feeding, and that begins to inhibit breastfeeding. I have a really busy week coming up, and I thought, what better way to reduce my stress than to go onto feastandfettle.com and order meals for that week so I can just take one thing off of my plate by putting delicious meals onto my plate. See what I did there? So I went on to their website. It's really easy to use. I looked at all of the menu options for the week, and some of the things I'm excited about are some grilled steak tips with a delicious Thai peanut sauce and some green beans with a soy sesame sauce that's on the side. But there's so many other things. And that is one of the ways that I am choosing to provide self-care for myself so that I can reduce my stress load. If you would like to do the same and spend more time with your family and less time worrying about what's for dinner, go to feastandfettle.com to get home cooked meals delivered right to your front door. And you can get $30 off your first week's delivery by using my code MILK, MILK. And just let somebody else cook for you. You won't regret it. If you're listening to this podcast, then you are more than aware of all the barriers that can make feeding our babies so difficult. You are also more than aware that support can make all the difference. So if you are struggling to feed your baby in the way that you had hoped, or if it is more stressful or anxiety inducing than you had anticipated, then what are you waiting for? I am here for you. Go to my website, www.quabbinbirthservices.com. I can't wait to connect with you. I can help you take the next right step in your baby feeding journey so that you feel less anxiety and get more joy out of those moments when you are feeding your baby. I can't wait to hear from you. Talk to you soon. Some babies end up being swaddled anywhere from 12 to 20 hours per day. And that definitely could undermine early nursing. And there are some studies to show that even though newborns should be feeding between 8 and 14 times a day, that babies who are swaddled on average will feed as little as 6 to 7 times a day because they just are not waking for those hunger cues. We also know that swaddling can sometimes undermine biobehavioral processes associated with hunger. So what does this mean? We know that there is an increase in cortisol production that is associated with separations between mother and baby, and that reduces infant appetite. And anytime there is a physical separation that prohibits skin-to-skin contact, it can also lead to reduction in the amount of intake that a baby has. So we see a correlation between reduction in skin-to-skin contact and a reduction in caloric intake between babies. We also see a reduction in the hormonal cycle of the prolactin levels and the oxytocin levels. Prolactin triggers milk production, and oxytocin stimulates the release of the milk. And these hormones are triggered in a variety of ways, including the sight, smell, sound, and feel of the infant. And if the infant is swaddled and separated from the mother, then there is a lower likelihood of the surge of those hormones, which is really fascinating. We also know that when infants are swaddled, there is a lower likelihood of parental responsiveness to infant hunger cues, which I discussed earlier. But when the baby is unswaddled and right with the parent, then they are able to notice the hunger cues, learn the hunger cues better, and then respond to them. And that makes it more likely for both the parent and the baby to communicate with each other about hunger cues and be more responsive to the hunger. And that allows the milk supply to come in more fully. Now, we know that there are times when infants are just really fussy and they're not hungry. They have fed fully and they are just tired and crying, and they cannot be satiated no matter what. Swaddling is a great tool for this. And I am not suggesting that we eliminate swaddling fully from the toolkit. But what I am suggesting is that in those early days and weeks when parents are trying to establish breastfeeding, that we consider teaching parents about continuous skin-to-skin contact, especially in the hospital and those early days of being home with their baby, and teaching parents about the early hunger cues. Learning as parents what your baby's early hunger cues are so that you understand how to be responsive to your baby, and so that baby is getting fed way more frequently. And the primary goal is not to have a baby sleeping quietly and snugly, but that the primary goal is getting to know your baby, getting to learn the baby's hunger cues, and using swaddling as a tool when baby is fully satiated, when we are sure that baby is not hungry, when we are sure that baby is not showing any hunger cues, and that if baby is being swaddled, that we are waking the baby frequently to feed the baby and allowing baby to show those hunger cues so that milk supply in the breastfeeding relationship becomes well established. I would love to know what your thoughts on swaddling are. So if this is something that worked for your family, or if in hearing this conversation you feel like, oh, maybe it's something that got in the way of your breastfeeding relationships, I would love to know about it. So join my Milk Making Minutes community group. I want to know all about how swaddling worked in your family and whether or not it helped keep you sane, or whether or not you feel like it may have interfered with your milk supply and your breastfeeding relationship. Talk to you soon. Bye.